Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to go over my statistics for my 2018 reading. This video is going to have a lot of numbers and graphs, so if that's not your thing, then I understand if you skip this one. But I personally love watching everyone's statistics videos, and of course I like to look at my own reading statistics. To come up with these statistics, I use a spreadsheet created by my friend Crinny. I will link the 2019 version of the spreadsheet down in the description box in case you're interested in tracking your reading. Let's start with looking at the number of books that I read. I did have a book that I started and then decided to pause in 2018. That book is not included in any of my statistics. I read a total of 52 books in 2018. Out of those 52 books, 7 of them were rereads, and then I had one additional book that I DNF'd. These numbers compared to last year show that this year I did a little more rereading and I had less DNFs, which I like. Then I wanted to look at the number of books that I read per month, and this is excluding the book that I DNF'd. So there's a total of 52 books here, and I read an average of 4.3 books every month, which is not all that different from what I read last year. The months that I read the most were April and December, and I read 6 books in both of those months. The months that I read the least were June, August, and September, where I read 3 books each. And this is just based on the number of books that I finished. If you look at it based on pages read, the month that I read the most pages was actually July. I read quite a bit more pages in July, but I only read 5 books. I read a total of 24,039 pages in all of 2018, which is a little more than 3,000 pages more than what I read last year. So that's quite a difference. The average number of pages I read each month was about 2,000, and that averaged out to about 66 pages a day, which is a good bit higher than my daily average from last year, which was 57. If you look at how big of books I was reading, most of the books that I read were between 300 and 500 pages, which I think makes sense. That's like the average length of a book. Comparing this graph to my graph from last year, I basically read more bigger books. I read more books that were 800 to 1,000 pages and less books that were 150 to 300 pages. Everything kind of just shifted up a little bit. My average page length across books was 459. Then I wanted to look at the format that I was reading things in. I only selected one format for each book, but realistically, I'm reading a lot of these books in multiple formats. Most of the time, it's audiobook plus either ebook or a physical copy. So when I was entering the books, I tried to pick the main format that I read it in, but a lot of times I ended up picking audiobook even if I read it equally in different formats. I want to figure out a way to have multiple formats per book because I think that this graph definitely skews how many audiobooks I'm reading. Like, I'm definitely reading that many audiobooks, but I'm also reading those same books in other formats, and that's not being represented by this graph. So I gotta figure out something different for next year. But as you can see, I read a lot of things on audio, and not surprisingly, I read more audiobooks this year than I did last year. And I don't see that changing in the next year. Basically, the only time I don't listen to an audiobook when I'm reading a book is if I can't get my hands on it at all. But if I can get it in addition to another physical copy of the book, I do, and I really enjoy reading that way. Next, let's look at my star ratings. And this graph is including my DNFs because I do personally rate my DNF books. I didn't have any 1-star books this year, which I had a good chunk of them last year. I had 4 2-star books, 8 3-star books, 22 4-star books, and 19 5-star books. I remember last year I had 18 5-star books and I thought that that was a lot, and it definitely is a lot, but it makes me laugh that I had more 5-star books this year than I did last year. But this year, unlike last year, I had more 4 stars than 5 stars. Last year I had mostly 5-star ratings. My average rating this year was a 4.1, and last year it was a 3.5. I'm pretty happy with about a 4-star average rating. Sometimes I worry that I'm not critical enough, but really I just want to have fun while I'm reading books, and if I have a 4-star average rating, that means I'm enjoying most of the books that I'm reading, and I'm totally fine with that. Alright, moving on to series. You guys know that one of my goals over this year was to cut down on the number of series that I was reading. I've been trying to avoid starting new series and really focusing on finishing series that I'm in the middle of. And I consider anything to be more than one book to be a series. So this year, 52% of the books that I read were part of a series, and 48% were standalones. This percentage is actually a little lower than the percentage of books that I read in a series last year, which was about 59%. So I'm a little surprised that that number went down. So this year I started 9 series, which is better than the 13 series I started in 2017. And 9 is way better than the 20 series I started in 2015 and in 2016. So you can see why I have a problem with reading too many series. I started way too many in 2015 and 2016. This year I completed 7 series, which I think is pretty good, especially considering in 2017 I only finished 3 series. But I also know that I was really focusing in on series where I only had 1 book left, and that's pretty much the only reason why I was able to finish 7. And then it was the end of the year and I was looking at these numbers and thinking that I had just added 2 series to my total number of series being read, which was 32 at the beginning of the year. Wasn't happy with that, so I went through and had a serious look at the remaining series that I'm reading, and I was able to decide not to continue in 8 of them compared to only DNFing 3 last year. So between finishing series and DNFing series, I got rid of 15, and now my current total is 26 series, which is much better than 32, but I still would like it to be a lot lower than that. So I'm gonna call that a win. I mean, it's only because I decided to DNF so many series, but I feel like I was being pretty true to myself as far as what series I wanted to quit reading, and I'm excited to focus in on the remaining series for the rest of this year. As far as how many series I read from in 2018, that was 20, which is about the same as I read from in 2017. Next, I wanted to look at the genre of books that I was reading from. So the way that I did this is that most books fell into multiple genres. None of these genres were mutually exclusive except for high fantasy and urban fantasy. I would just pick one or the other based on if it was completely in a new world or if it was partially set in our world. The way that I categorize these is definitely not perfect, and it's a little bit of a simplified way of looking at book genres, but I just did it in a way that made sense to me. I felt like I read a lot more books outside of fantasy and sci-fi this year, but looking at this graph just shows me how much I really do love fantasy, because I read 20 books that were high fantasy and 9 books that I classified as urban fantasy, followed closely by science fiction at 8 books. So while I did read a varied amount of genres, I still read a good amount of fantasy, which I like to see. So comparing this graph to my graph from last year, I read more contemporary this year. That column definitely moved to the left a little bit, and I also read more horror this year. Last year I didn't have a column for literary fiction, and while none of the books that I read this year were like straight literary fiction, I read multiple books that kind of had a literary fiction feel or towed the line between literary fiction and other genres. So that was cool to add a genre to the list. And then I looked at the publication year of the books that I read this year. I was just looking at backlist versus frontlist, so what that means are books published before 2018 versus books published in 2018. So I read about 72% backlist, and 28% of my reading were books that were released in 2018. This isn't all that different from last year, which was 70% versus 30%. Partway through this year, I actively decided to stop requesting ARCs and was trying to focus more on backlist books, so I'm a little surprised that it ended up being so close to what I read last year. I tend to enjoy older books more than new releases, and so I'm glad that I read more backlist. Next, I wanted to look at the authors that I read from. I read from a total of 44 authors, which is quite a bit more than I read from last year. Last year, I only read from 34 authors. And out of them, the author that I read the most books from was Robert Jordan, which doesn't surprise me because of the Waddalong. And most of those were rereads, so I wanted to see what other author I read the most from, and that was Victoria Schwab. I read 3 books from her. And then last but not least, I wanted to look at age category of the books that I read. So this year, I read 35 adult books, so it made up 66% of my reading. I read 16 YA books, which was 30% of my reading, and I read 2 NA books, which was about 4% of my reading. So compared to last year, this is actually quite different. Basically, the number of YA and adult books that I read this year is flip-flopped from what I read last year. Last year, I read like 30 YA books. I knew that I was reading more adult books this year, but this definitely wasn't a conscious choice. I like reading YA, so I'm kind of surprised that I read as little as I did. Another difference is that last year I read a couple of middle grade books, but this year I didn't read any middle grade books, and I want that to change in 2019. I really do love reading middle grade, but I haven't read it in a really long time, so I want to make that a little more of a priority in 2019. As far as the split between adult and YA, I'm really not going to shoot for any specific ratio. We'll just see how it turns out. My guess is that I'm going to continue to read more adult than YA though. Alright guys, so those are all of my statistics for the books that I read in 2018. I hope you guys enjoyed getting a little nerdy with me with these graphs and numbers. I have a lot more end of year wrap-up videos coming. I'll link my playlist for them down in the description box. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. I post 1 to 2 times a week. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. Today I'm here to go over my statistics covering about... Today, I read a total of 53 books in the, but I am, and really I made some hard to DNF or not to DNF, but I feel like I was bidding, I can't say this word.